I'm going to talk today about journalism and the process of making journalism social. I am drawing on research that I'm 3/4 of the way through for my PhD, looking at what we're referring to as a longitudinal study, although it only started in 2009, which gives you an indication of how quickly social media is transforming journalism, or at least having an impact on the processes and practices of journalists in the space. But the comments that I'll make and some of the ideas that I'll float are not exclusive to a relationship with Twitter. They really apply to a range of social media platforms and the process of journalism generally in the social media space. We're talking, of course, about platforms like Facebook, which has extraordinary penetration in the Australian community. According to Nielsen, 10.2 million Australians are active on Facebook, which is still a mind-blowing statistic to grapple with from somebody who hailed from traditional media and the very traditional environment of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which was where I spent my professional journalism life prior to becoming an academic and continuing as a freelancer. And I still call myself a journalist, which some journalists find unsettling, but nevertheless that's what I am. And I've always thought of myself as being a conversationalist, which is really what social media is all about. So I'm saying that journalism is becoming social. I'm saying that the transformative effect of Twitter is helping to propel that socialisation of journalism. And I expect some of you may want to interpret that as a sort of a left-leaning polemic. It's not the way it was intended, but rather to refer to the social nature of interaction. So by social, just to define some terms, I mean interactive and open and inclusive, collaborative and responsive. Those are the sorts of words that are emerging generally in discussions about the transformation of journalism, but also specifically in the research that I'm doing, which is focused on the experience of a significant cohort of journalists who were early adopters of social media. And John Powles, who's an academic at ANU who teaches music but who is an active tweeter and uses social media very actively in his teaching, got involved with me in a discussion last night on Twitter about this talk, all about the role of social media in journalism. And what he said was, to him, social equals human. So in some respects we're talking about the sort of humanisation, the accessibility of journalism. I'm also talking about, of course, the role that social media as a series of platforms in the media space is playing in that process of transformation. And the optimists among those of us who are researching and practising in social media are hopeful that this transformation, which may indeed be ongoing, but they're hopeful that it will also ultimately result in a renaissance for professional journalism. By mobile, I mean both literally devices like this, devices that allow what we contribute, what we produce, how we interact, allow that to be transportable and allow it to be instantaneous. And I don't just mean, smartphones, I'm talking about the iPad, any form of transportable screen-based technology that allows us to interact with one another. Mobile is certainly becoming ubiquitous, and I think as much as the future of journalism is social, it's also about mobile. So mobile and social is what the future is going to look like. And of course, even as I talk, there are people globally, particularly in places like Africa, where online connectivity has had a relatively minor impact, particularly on journalism because of access issues and economic issues. Mobile technology has become incredibly entrenched very quickly, and the future of journalism is being played out in places like that, almost stepping over the initial phase of online journalism that required PC access, for example, and going direct to mobile. So what do I mean by making journalism social? Well, it's a story about the transformation of journalism, or at least some pockets of it, into a truly community-engaged, interactive, collaborative process. And I keep hearing journalists and other researchers say things like, Twitter isn't journalism. So let's just get that out of the road up front. Of course, Twitter isn't journalism. Twitter is a platform on which journalism can be done and is being done minute by minute, second by second, in fact, around the world. And if you're in any doubt about the sort of role that a platform like Twitter can play, particularly in a breaking news story, just cast your mind back from the Osama bin Laden assassination, which was unwittingly live tweeted by an Abbottabad computer programmer running a coffee shop, and the details of the assassination were effectively leaked on that platform by a former Bush government aide. We then had the tsunamis in Japan, the devastating earthquake, the natural disasters in Australia earlier in the year, right back to the first breaking news event that is associated with Twitter's incursion into daily journalism, which was the Hudson River plane crash. And that involved a ferry operator, or passenger rather, on a ferry. The operator was taking the ferry to the rescue scene on the Hudson River, and he took a snap on his mobile phone of the plane crashed into the river, which you would recognise if you saw it, and that became viral almost instantly as a result of him posting it on Twitter via his mobile phone, and it was shared around the world. So that's the sort of historic trajectory of the role of Twitter in the context of social media here. I also am saying that this is a process of making journalism and journalists social, because there's been quite a degree of resistance on the part of individual journalists and on the part of certain media organisations. That's occurred globally, but we've certainly witnessed it in Australia as well. Some have literally had to be dragged kicking and screaming into this new world where there is daily or hourly interaction with journalists, with the people formerly known as the audience, as Jay Rosen calls them, as well as other journalists. So it's not just a case of sitting in a newsroom and discussing what event you were just at and how you might report it and who else you might speak to, but it's a process now that involves public interaction. And that in itself is quite a challenge to a very traditional paradigm, which has seen journalists seat themselves above the audience. And there in fact is an unwritten law historically, and one which was certainly echoed when I was a young journalist in the late 80s and the early 90s in training, which was that a journalist should not be influenced by the great unwashed being, of course, folk like you, the general public. Now, while that has its roots in an idea of independence, which allows journalists not to be unduly influenced by power brokers, for example, it's unfortunately been translated over time into an idea which sees journalists seeing themselves very much as separate from the general public and separate from citizens, rather than active engagers with both of those groups. So I mean, literally, while some journalists early on got involved in social media through involvement, particularly with Twitter, there are very many others who have refused to engage in the process of social journalism. And I was at a conference at the BBC a month ago where several senior editors from some of the world's biggest mastheads lamented the fact that it had been quite difficult to effect the transformation even within their newsrooms of encouraging journalists to become very socially interactive using these platforms for both traditional journalistic purposes but also for the new function of engagement with audiences. And one of them, I won't identify where they were from because we were controversially operating under Chatham House rules at the time, one of them said that it was time to just move on, to accept that some journalists will never change, they will never get it. He was exhausted from trying to drag them with him, and this was time now, 2 or 3 years down the track from the initial kind of engagement with social media for the rest of us to just move on and get on with it, which is quite an interesting position to hear, given that there was only 2 years ago when I ran a conference at the ABC on the role of social media in journalism's future. We heard from many journalists in the audience that engagement was quite a threatening idea. It was quite an alien concept to news journalists in particular. So while we've traditionally had involvement with audiences through interactions such as writing letters to the editor and through talkback radio, for example, which I originally cast as the first incarnation of social media, Those were mediated platforms. They were not open in the sense that we understand social media to be. So there were gatekeepers, there were producers and presenters who were deciding who would get to air, how long they would get to air for, what they would get to say. In other words, if you said something or you indicated you would say something that was inappropriate, you wouldn't get to air. You might find yourself dumped if you strayed into territory that was inappropriate. And what's changed with social media is that traditional power base of journalists disseminating information from the top down and sitting from that position of power, determining how stories will be framed and how they should be interpreted, perhaps. We are now in a situation where literally any citizen with access to technology is able to, and something to say, and a capacity with language, is able to say and report what they think and what they see and what they feel. Questions come up all the time about what that means really, because if they're not saying anything of value, does it really matter? Well, when you look at the kinds of statistics that we're seeing that indicate the prolific uptake of citizens' engagement with social media, from the prolific number of videos being uploaded to YouTube. One statistic that sticks in my mind is in a 60-day period, more video was uploaded to YouTube than in the previous 60 years of US television history. Now, the point is not so much, when you think about statistics like that, what people are filming and sharing, but that they are, and that therefore means that journalists and media organisations have to figure out why they're doing that, get into the spaces where people are producing content and sharing content, and also start to allow greater collaboration between audiences. So journalism has always been about social engagement in the sense that journalists have sought information, they have asked questions, they have also desired to start a conversation. I don't know if you recall, in fact, Fairfax about a decade ago had a campaign promoting their content with the Start a Conversation tagline. So it's not that journalists have been averse to the concept of conversation, but rather they didn't necessarily have an expectation that the public would speak back, certainly not directly to news journalists. They might write that letter to the editor, they might call talkback, but the idea of a journalist's daily work also including interaction with the public in a guise other than just sources, potential sources or readers, that was an alien concept. So we've had a phase now of what people are calling journalism 1.0, if you like, which involved this engagement that I'm talking about based on an unequal power relationship with the story gathering and the story framing and the distribution of content within journalists' control. And we moved into a secondary phase, journalism 2.0 if you like, where we had journalists in social media spaces thinking about what they were doing in terms of promoting what they were talking about, promoting stories that they'd written, talking about themselves, broadcasting really to the public. And certainly curating content along the way, so bringing together interesting links that they want to share with audiences, for example. But it didn't really involve much interaction with audiences beyond the occasional kind of thanks for commenting on my piece scenario. So what this means is that journalists had become not just people who were contributing ideas that should be debated, but that they were also trying to, even if unwittingly, elicit responses from audiences. And in that context, they found themselves subject to quite a degree of criticism from the general public. They found themselves sometimes verbally assaulted. They certainly found complaints landing at their doorstep, if you like, in the tweet stream. If they wrote something that was unpopular, unappealing, controversial, they got smacked down on Twitter by people who were critical. And that's not something that they'd been used to before. There had been layers and layers of filtering processes within media organisations. That has resulted, interestingly, in a kind of re-entrenchment along the way of journalists' attitudes towards trying to preserve the current status, the current power that journalists have had, rather than being willing to really open up the processes and practices of journalism to scrutiny and to collaboration. And as a result of that re-entrenchment, the public became, instead of being enthusiastic about the role that journalists were playing through social media as they initially were, really encouraged to see journalists in those spaces, wanting to contribute to debates, they became increasingly agitated. And this really came to the fore during the 2010 federal election, when a Canberra-based public servant called Greg Jericho was blogging and tweeting pseudonymously as Grog's Gamut. Now, he wrote a scathing blog post about the press gallery coverage of politics. He was extremely critical of the framing of political stories. He wrote in a way that got to the core problem in political journalism, some might say, which is a focus on politicking instead of a focus on policy, and the complicity between journalists and politicians in the framing of news in that manner. While some journalists responded really positively to that piece, and among them was Tony Wright from The Age, who tweeted, "Look, I think we need to think about this. He raises some good points." Many journalists bristled. They became incredibly defensive. They behaved in an arrogant and dismissive way towards people in their audience. They really alienated themselves as a group from consumers, and that was incredibly problematic. And then we saw a process in the Australian setting of the other group of journalists, the journalists who were willing to engage and interact and incorporate the contributions of the community in the reframing of what it means to be a journalist and what journalism is, stepping into the debate and finding themselves being targeted by some of those inside the Church of Journalism who had decided that these were the rules we would play by and this is how the game would be played. What I'm getting at here is a reference to a theory in journalism studies called paradigm repair. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that theory. It sounds very highfalutin, but it actually is easy to engage with and understand. And it basically implies that as a professional group, journalists become very defensive when their professional practice and their professional norms, when their sort of the canons of journalism, things like objectivity and relationships with sources and so on, are challenged, particularly when they're challenged from the outside. And that's the dominant paradigm. They then seek to try to repair that or to reinstate it very forcefully as the norm. The problem arises when in a situation like journalism as it currently stands, which is in a state of perpetual transformation, partly as a result of technology, partly as a result of failing business models, but importantly also as a result of a loss of faith and trust by the community in journalists and journalistic practices. And we really need, I think, as a profession, and media organisations need to take much more notice of the role that transparency plays, the role that transparency plays in achieving credibility as a journalism cohort and as a fraternity. And we need to think about involving the community in a very open way in redefining what some of those core tenets might be. We're talking about challenging long-term power bases here and doing so through the use of new technology and timeframes which are instantaneous in the processing of news, which result in a very disruptive effect, all of which amounts to quite threatening change. But Alan Rusbridger, who's the editor-in-chief of The Guardian newspaper, who closed the conference where I spoke recently, said it was time to even move on from talking about journalism as a social act, as an act of collaboration with audiences, and to refer to it instead as open journalism. So journalism that was completely transparent, a process he was describing which involves a recognition that journalism doesn't stop at the publication of the story or the tweet or the broadcast, but rather the ongoing conversation becomes part of the act of journalism itself. So in other words, the comments below the line are actually part of the story. That's how he's re-envisaging journalism at The Guardian under his open journalism terminology. So he in fact told me in an interview I did with him for my PhD research that he, looking down the barrel of a failed and failing business model, which is dependency on a trust, had only one shot left, and that was the reinvention of journalism as a very open model, a model where trust could be regained from the public, which would result in such a sense of investment in the content that people could be depended upon to reward The Guardian with its continued financial viability after the trust fund runs out in a decade or so. And I, for one, think the world would be a very sad place without publications like The Guardian. So I'm not, despite some people's attempts to characterise me thus, somebody who's championing the demise of all newspapers. Rather, I'm championing a future which is much more inclusive, where journalists are able to see themselves less on a pedestal or at a podium and much more as part of the audience. So in fact, Jay Rosen's quote, which I referred to earlier, is very helpfully inverted by a woman called Bronwyn Clun, who was originally a Perth-based journalist, who talks about control media, and this process that I'm now speaking about is the antithesis. It's open journalism. She also takes that quote that Rosen has helpfully shared with us about audiences and inverts it to become journalists are the audience, formerly known as the media, which is a really interesting idea, I think, and one that's worth pursuing. So I started off by saying that, or at least referencing the point that was being made to me over and over again, that Twitter isn't journalism. Well, it may not be, but what it is doing is creating an opportunity for engagement with audiences, for interaction, for collaboration on stories, and it's facilitating the transformation that's occurring. And what I think we need to understand is that conversation and interaction are actually elements of journalism. They are part of the process. And if we make the process of journalism, even controversially, the process of verification, which remains an ongoing conundrum for journalists who are using social media. If you hear something, how do you go about verifying it through a social media platform? Well, controversially, journalists like Andy Carvin at NPR are saying that they can use a platform like Twitter to put the rumour out there and to correct the rumour by interacting with the audience, by asking the people who follow him, for example, what they know, how they know it, and to try and verify through an open process what's going on a particular story at a particular time. It is a controversial concept, but it does lead to this idea of making content out of process, which is talking about reporting on journalism as it unfolds and involving communities in that process, and certainly makes journalists more accountable in one sense, in that the public can see what process of verification has gone into to an act of journalism prior to publication. So I think I'm heading towards time, and I do want to hear from you guys, obviously. But just to tell you that I ran a little poll on Twitter yesterday, which was nothing, it certainly wasn't an attempt at scientific research, and only 65 people responded. But I asked people, had Twitter made journalism more social? And for those of you who are interested, 92% of people said that it had made journalism more social, and 49% of those said without a doubt. Only one person said it hadn't made journalism more social. Not surprising, given that I asked a bunch of people on Twitter what they thought about Twitter, but there you have it, an act at least of making this talk, or the preparation for it, social. And that's where I will leave it. Thank you.